All right, awesome. So back to it. Pheochromocytoma is a type of neuroendocrine tumor affecting both the nervous system and the endocrine system. So if you look at this chart of symptoms here, it kind of falls into our case study. He's hypertensive, he's sweating, he has, headache, big panic attacks and anxiety, pallor, which is paleness. We didn't see these things, but we did see that digestive issue. So you can see it's going to affect the blood vessels. It's going to affect skin, the nervous system right here, and digestive system. So let's kind of break into some of those. So part A, a pheochromocytoma typically targets which endocrine gland? So it is going to attack this gland. Does anyone know from anatomy what this gland right here is? This is the kidney and it sits on top of it. Exactly, so the adrenal gland, yes, and specifically the cortex. So what is happening is the that's a hard word to say, pheochromocytoma is affecting either one or both of the adrenal glands, and we're having this increased release of adrenaline. So it's kind of putting our body in this constant fight or flight mode, which is not good. We are normally in rest and digest for the majority of our lifetimes. Fight or flight kicks in areas and times of high stress. And of course, we don't want to be stressed out all the time. So this is not a good condition to have. You're not going to be feeling good. Your sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in and things are going to start to go wrong. So let's look at some of those things. So again, it's going to cause the overproduction of those adrenaline hormones. What are our two adrenaline hormones? Exactly. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are catecholamines. So what we see is that an increase in these hormones is going to cause the sympathetic nervous system to ramp up. So remember, sympathetic nervous system is rest and digest. Sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. So PNS is rest, digest. I always think like parasympathetic. When you're paralyzed, you're probably going to be doing a lot of resting, digesting. SNS, sympathetic nervous system, is that fight or flight response. So you can think sympathetic, you would probably feel sympathy for someone if they're really stressed. So in that fight or flight, state. So yeah, but what causes this fight or flight response to ramp up, kick up, is the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline hormones. So looking at the next part, we're seeing why would a patient with a pheochromocytoma sweat excessively? So what happens is you can see this diagram of the skin, and you can see that we have sweat glands throughout. Specifically, what we're looking at now is the eccrine sweat glands. You're born with the eccrine sweat glands. That's the sweat glands that like babies have. That's why when babies sweat, it doesn't produce a really bad odor. So we see that these eccrine sweat glands contain alpha-1 receptors. And we haven't gotten to this part in lecture yet, talking about our alpha and beta receptors, but we'll kind of scratch the surface with them today. So what we see is that, again, real quick, those apocrine sweat glands, those are the smelly ones that come after puberty. Those are not what we're talking about. Those aren't the ones containing the alpha-1 receptors. The eccrine glands are the ones that contain those alpha-1 receptors and are going to cause this increased sweat response. But what we see is that those adrenaline hormones will target alpha-1 receptors. And with increased levels of our adrenaline hormones, they'll constantly target those receptors, which will cause the production of sweat, the overproduction of sweat. So eccrine sweat glands contain those alpha-1 receptors. Alpha-1 receptors deal with adrenaline. So when we're increasing too much adrenaline, they're going to cause an increased amount of sweat production. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So this is kind of showing that increase in SNS activity. However, I just got note from the other two TAs that this is kind of actually not correct. So it's actually kind of an exception to SNS activity. Normally, whenever you kick in fight or flight, you don't sweat as much. You kind of like dry up, you kind of hold in water. So this is actually an exception to SNS activity. So this is not an increase in SNS activity. This sweat response is the one exception we're looking at today that doesn't have to deal with that sympathetic nervous system activity. So normally, like in a fight or flight situation, you're going to kind of like dry up. I know for some reason when I take exams, I normally stress to the point where I feel like I'm sweating more. However, that's going to be a different response, not an SNS activity response. All right, cool. So looking at part D, oops, I messed up this. That should not be there, but I'll fix that later. But we're now looking at how this would affect the blood vessels and which receptors it would bind to. So when looking at the blood vessels, or when looking at the receptors, we see that, again, alpha-1 are going to be found in those eccrine glands and also the blood vessels. So alpha-1 is in those eccrine glands that we looked at earlier and the blood vessels. Alpha-2 will be found in the brain and the periphery. So like our peripheral organs, like the digestive organs and, the peripheral organs. Beta-1 is going to affect the heart. And beta-2 is going to be, those receptors will be found in the airway, specifically in the bronchi of the lungs. When looking at which hormone would bind on blood vessels, or this excess hormone, where it would bind, it's going to be those alpha-1 receptors, because we find those in the blood vessels as well. So part D is looking at the effect on the blood vessels. So the hormone, adrenaline, those excess hormones will bind to those alpha-1 receptors as well. Now we're going to look at the effect of on the blood vessels. So when we have an increased adrenaline response, our blood vessels are going to kind of get smaller. They're going to kind of shrink. And this is what we call vasoconstriction. So vasodilation is when they widen. Vasoconstriction is when they shrink. So they get smaller, they constrict. So what we see is that vasoconstriction will be our answer there. And we'll kind of hit that more in this upcoming slide. But adrenaline, again, is going to cause those vessels to constrict. And that is an increase in SNS activity. So vasoconstriction deals with sympathetic nervous system activity, fight or flight. So when looking at that increased vasoconstriction, how would this contribute to his hypertension? If you're not super familiar with what hypertension is, it is high blood pressure. So hypertension, high tension on the arteries, which results in high blood pressure. So vasoconstriction is going to increase peripheral resistance, which will increase blood pressure. If you have like a circle or a hose, let's say, this is a hose, and then you like put your thumb in it, and then you kind of like turn it into this amount of room, the flow rate is going to be a lot, calmer. It's going to kind of flow out compared to if you constrict the hose, it's coming out like really hard. So that would be like dilation and constriction. So whenever we constrict, a tube of any sort, including the vessels, that's going to be a lot of resistance. We have increased resistance here, so the walls will have further resistance, and that's going to increase blood pressure. Any questions on that? Cool. And then how would this help to explain Rolly's facial pallor or pallor? So this is talking about why his face is kind of like blue. So vasoconstriction occurs also, in those cutaneous blood vessels. Cutaneous is that layer of the skin, which let me see, I have a picture right here. You can see the cutaneous vessels right here down at the bottom. So those are the vessels that are in the skin. So whenever, oops. Okay, there we go. So whenever we have vasoconstriction, those are going to constrict and they come closer into the body. That takes away color. That makes you look more pale. You can think of, like, I know Halloween's coming up. I love the movie The Shining. If you're like really cold, what's going to happen is your blood vessels will constrict to move closer to the body to stay warm. Kind of same thing happening here, except he's not cold. He might even be hot, but we're still having that constriction and pulling in response, which is going to make you look more pale. Like if you're ever really cold, you normally look pale. But we know he's also dealing with excessive sweating, so that's not a cold response. It's an incorrect response from the sympathetic nervous system. All right, any questions on that one? Cool.
So you're saying that's another exception?
No, it's not an exception. It's kind of, the reason that the increased sweating was an exception was because it's, of course, when they hit me with it right before class too. This is not an exception because this is, I don't know, I'll get back to you on that. But this is not an exception. This is a sympathetic nervous system response. Compared to the last one, this isn't a central sympathetic nervous system response. So this should say not an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity. And this is an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, but for the wrong reason. Yeah. Okay, cool. Any more questions? Awesome. All right, so part E, we are now looking at the predicted effect of this tumor on the smooth muscles of the GI tract and which of his symptoms could be explained by this. So what we see is that sympathetic nervous system activity will inhibit digestive functioning. So if you're in a fight or flight situation, like you're running from a bear or something, you're not going to be feeling hungry. You can skip a meal to, run from that bear. You're kind of like hunger instincts go away. So again, this is sympathetic nervous system, so that fight or flight. And this will affect digestion, hunger, nutrient absorption, and other digestive functions as well. So, fight or flight. If you're really nervous for an exam, this always happens to me. I get super nervous for the exam. I go in and my stomach's making weird sounds the whole time, which makes me even more nervous. And that's because my fight or flight system's, kicking in and digestion gets all messed up. I also don't feel too hungry the day of exam, so I'm nervous. I skip a meal, then I don't have enough glucose to fuel my brain, and I'm like, why didn't I eat? And other things can be as paired as well. I have friends that get really nauseous before exams, friends that get stomach aches before exams. That's because of that fight or flight activity, that sympathetic nervous system activity. So when looking back at that case study, we did see that Rolly was experiencing constipation. So that's going to be kind of due to this decreased activity of the smooth muscles of the GI tract due to this right here. So that constipation, we're decreasing activity, so that would make sense. Same thing, decreased activity, decreased hunger, decreased activity, not great digestion, all of those things as well. All right, questions? Nope. Cool. All righty. Oops, messed up the animation here as well. All right, so when predicting the effect of the neuroendocrine disorder on his heart, what we see is that, heart rate, of course, is going to be increased whenever we are having excess adrenaline being released. You think when you get nervous, your heart rate goes up, of course. Stroke volume is also going to increase because with stroke volume, we're looking at how much blood is being sent out per contraction. And if we're having a lot of contractions, aka beats of the heart, we're going to be sending out a lot more blood volume. Cardiac output will also be increased because cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. So if we have increased heart rate and increased stroke volume, we're of course going to have an increased cardiac output. And that's looking at how much blood is being sent out of the heart per minute. So stroke volume is per beat, cardiac output is per minute. So one thing that's interesting is that stroke volume is only going to be affected by the sympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic nervous system will slow our heart rate. Whenever we're in rest and digest, our heart rate will kind of slow down. However, we're not going to change the stroke volume. SNS is going to increase both heart rate and stroke volume because our fight or flight response needs to be quick. We really need to up that cardiac output. So to do that, we need to increase both of these. Yeah, heart will have to pump harder. Okay, cool. All right, so when looking at this response, this increased cardiac output, we see that it's going to contribute to his hypertension due to that increased cardiac output will increase blood pressure. So if we have an increased heart rate, increased stroke volume, we're pushing a lot more blood through those vessels at a lot higher rate. This is going to kind of overwhelm the vessels and lead to a higher blood pressure. When looking at how it's going to contribute to his AFib, AFib means like an irregular heartbeat. So it's kind of off rhythm. If you look at an EKG, it's not going to be that pretty P wave, QRS complex, all of that. It's going to kind of like alter, and that's not good. We need regular electrical signals going through the heart. So what we see is that the SNS is also going to kind of increase the effects of the SA node. So the SA node is right here, the sinoatrial node, and it kind of is the pacemaker of the heart. It controls the rhythm of the heart. So what we see is that SNS activity is going to kind of affect this, and it will also be affected by PSNS activity. So we see that nerves innervate the SA node from both systems. So parasympathetic nervous system nerves and sympathetic nervous system nerves innervate the SA node. And whenever we're having increased or incorrect responses from those sympathetic nervous system nerves, that's going to lead to irregular heartbeats because there's no fight or flight situation for Rolly. He's just sitting there. So his PSNS is sending, beat regularly. We don't need to increase heart rate or anything like that. But then his SNS system is kicked into gear because of the increased release of adrenaline. So those are kind of counteracting each other. They're kind of like going in at different times, which is going to cause that, irregular heartbeat. All right. Any questions there? Okay, cool. So increased cardiac output will also deal with binding of receptors. We know that alpha-1 is dealing with the blood vessels and eccrine glands. So it's not going to be alpha. Oh, my animations are all messed up today. But it's going to be beta-1 because beta-1 is dealing with the heart. The heart is made up of specialized tissues like the myocardium, the endothelium, all of that. So the heart is different from the other areas of the body. Alpha-1, again, deals with blood vessels and eccrine. Alpha-2 is the brain and peripheral organs. Beta-2 is the airways, and then beta-1 is the heart. Dr. Chang kind of just put these answer choices in there to confuse us. Those are receptors that we aren't going to look at or we aren't looking at during this unit, so they're kind of just there to confuse you. But yeah, beta-1 is going to be the receptor that is going to be affected with that increased cardiac output response. All right, cool. So part G, what we see is that We are now going to look at the endocrine effect. So looking at the pancreas, that's kind of the endocrine area of this disorder. Again, just a little refresher. Insulin will decrease blood sugar and glucagon will increase blood sugar. So insulin decreasing it, glucagon increasing it. So with insulin, we're taking sugar from the blood and putting it into the cells. So moving it from the blood in insulin, moving it into the cells, so decreasing blood sugar. And glucagon is getting it gone from the cells and putting it back into the blood. So it's going to increase that blood sugar. So what we see is that with the release of insulin, whenever we're having this disorder, it's going to be decreased. So it will decrease. Whenever we look at the release of glucagon, it will increase. So we're going to be having way too much sugar in the blood. And that would be a fight or flight response because blood sugar is how you fuel your muscles. So, you know, if we're in some type of fight or flight, like we need to fight an animal that's attacking us or something, we need a lot of blood sugar going to our skeletal muscles so we can fight off whatever is coming at us. So we, with increased SNS activity, we will have the decreased release of insulin, the increased release of glucagon. So when looking at the receptor that it's going to bind to, what do y'all think? It's going to be the alpha 2. So remember, alpha 2 is dealing with the brain and peripheral organs. So the pancreas is a peripheral organ. So alpha 2 is what is going to be the receptor that the SNS hormones are targeting here. And then lastly, which of early symptoms would be explained by this? What we know, high blood sugar, that is hyperglycemia. Oops. So hyperglycemia is that high blood sugar response that really was diagnosed with when the doctors ran the labs. So that's kind of it. That's all we have for today. It was a pretty straightforward worksheet. I'll take any questions over it, but if not, you're free to go. And I can also return to slides if you need to write anything extra. Yeah.
Does the release of SNS hormones automatically inhibit the release of CNS hormones? Or can both still be released?
So it depends on what area they're targeting. So it'll just be which, they can both be released at the same time, but it depends on which receptors will actually accept them. Yeah, so yeah, they can both be released. Like adrenaline can be released at the same time as one of the PSNS hormones, but normally I think adrenaline kind of overrules when it comes to the receptors. Yeah. All right, cool. Awesome. Does anyone need me to go back to a slide or anything? Nope. All right, y'all are free to go. Sorry, that was a quick discussion today, but whatever.